Warning: graphic content. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to LEL Radio. Joined by my partner, Collin Congleton, our use of force expert, and today we're going to be breaking down this officer-involved shooting, relating it to a couple of other recent events to help us understand how to better approach these situations in the future. I will begin by caveating saying that we are not here to criticize the officers. I was not in that situation. I don't know all of the facts prior to that situation. No one does except for those specific officers. It'll be up to them to testify. It'll be up to a judge to ultimately say that this shooting was justified. But Collin, how do you want to open this up? Talk about tactics?
Yeah, why don't, Joey, why don't you just give a quick rundown of what happened here and what, in simple terms, what the officers are doing?
Sure. With this specific incident, we have a officer-involved shooting that was right at the end of a vehicle pursuit. This vehicle that they were pursuing was wanted for a shooting. They had a very particularized description of that vehicle. They had the license plate, make, color, the model. It was a black Honda Accord. Officers found the vehicle, initiated a pursuit in the largest city in the country, the busiest city in the country. Right upon the crash, the officers ran up on the car, and as he ran up on the car, he was met by, unfortunately, the barrel of a handgun. The officer immediately was able to discharge his weapon. They shot a total of 19 shots in this incident, ultimately killing the suspect. So how would you suggest about approaching these incidents in the future?
Well, there's a couple of things. Obviously, I guess a good starting point would be recognizing that we're looking at this because it's a high-profile incident. It's, what we would consider a critical incident because of what happens at the end. And when we evaluate officers' actions, we have a tendency, both inside of our profession and outside with the public and with our civilian leadership, we have a tendency to start at the end, and particularly where there's a bad outcome. We start with that outcome and assume that if the outcome was bad, then the officers did something wrong, and that's not always the case. Many times, you can do everything right and still end up with a bad outcome. Sometimes you do something wrong, and we're going to talk about this in a couple of minutes, and end up with a good outcome, maybe even many times, and it works until it doesn't. So I guess a good starting point would be, again, recognizing that we're looking at this because of the outcome, but when we evaluate it, we really need to evaluate step by step from the beginning and understand that human beings in general, not just police officers, but human beings will do what makes sense to them in the moment, especially under stress. And when we evaluate the officer's actions, a lot of us will look at what they did and say, that doesn't make sense to me. While I'm sitting in my office watching it a week after the fact, it doesn't make sense to me why they would do that. Well, certainly there was a reason for them to do what they did in the moment. And when we evaluate these situations, we want to understand what that reasoning was, what the thought process was. And if it's faulty, then go on and correct that through training or retraining. So that's my starting point.
And one of the things I think that's worth jumping right into with respect to this, when you watch that video in full speed, it's very difficult to see what the officer saw. And no, in other videos we've talked about the issues with body worn camera footage. It's really not until they slow down that body camera footage and then even we get that freeze frame that I'll put up right here. Look at that freeze frame. Look at the way that that officer, when he ran up on the vehicle, he saw a barrel of a gun pointing at him. Nobody wants to be met with that at any point in their career. So watching these videos one time and simply swiping through videos on Facebook or Instagram, doesn't give you the full perception of these incidents. Exactly what you said, especially when that's the first thing you see. The perception could be misinterpreted as being that this officer ran up on the car with the intent to just shoot this guy. And that definitely wasn't the intent.
Yeah, so on the subject of video, I cannot overstate the importance of what I'm about to say on that. People need to understand that video does not tell a complete story, and very often it doesn't even tell an accurate story. Most people, you don't know what you don't know. And most people have no idea just how technical video is and how many technical aspects of it come into play when we are evaluating human performance, especially in critical incidents. And just to throw out a couple of things, right? Frame rate, compression, what is happening, what is going on in the real world in between those frames, in between those opening and closing of the shutter, right? When you upload video to whatever platform it may be, but especially with social media, how much is it being compressed, and what is that doing to the quality of the video? What are we not seeing? Uh, how does the fisheye lens of a body worn camera distort uh, the the perception of depth, right? How far away is the subject we're looking at in real life, and in the perception of the officer versus how it is depicted in that video? Lighting, uh, positioning of the camera versus where the officer's focus is, field of view, all sorts of things. I mean, we could go on for hours about uh, just skimming the surface of some of the technical aspects of video and how important it is to understanding that when we use it as a tool to help us understand a critical incident. So, with that being said, accept that the video is just giving us some idea of the events, and it is certainly not an accurate depiction of what the officers perceived and experienced.
That's important to understand too, especially with obviously the goal, and I think rightfully so, is to have transparency for what the police are doing in the street, especially for something as critical as an officer involved shooting where somebody lost their life. That's obviously the last thing that anyone wants to see happen. But when we see these incidents and all you see is one body camera, one angle, it doesn't pick up total perception. If my body camera is pointed here, but my head is turned to the right, there's two completely different events that are being captured by each of those perceptions. And part of the problem when you don't have full testimony, you don't have police reports completed at that point in the investigation, um, it leads to what could be a misinterpretation of facts. And we've seen that across the country on other incidents. Not to dive too deep into that topic, but it is very critically important for people, especially people that aren't in law enforcement, to understand the issues that are associated with body-worn camera footage.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk briefly about tactics. So, anytime I see videos like this, and having been part of pursuits, and I know you've been part of pursuits, um, your adrenaline spikes through the roof. Your heart is pumping. You are ready to go. It's the analogy I use is like it's like the canine that's ready to attack the guy with the red suit, and he's being held on his leash and he's ready to go. He's barking like physically. The canine handler is holding him back, and then when he lets go of the leash, the canine is off and he attacks the guy with the red suit. The That's kind of what your emotions feel like in a pursuit. Like there's so much leading up to that moment of when it ends. And a majority of these pursuits, unfortunately, end in a crash. Crashes usually then turn into a bailout, and that bailout turns into a foot pursuit. And then ultimately the goal is to capture whoever that fleeing felon is. But that's not always the case, as we see here. And I'll bring up the Cranford video momentarily. that we could talk about as a sidebar. But I think the more that we see these videos, the more that we need to recognize we have to revisit our tactics and see, is this the best thing to do at that moment? And my goal with talking about this, and I've talked about this in countless roll calls with my guys, is to get you to have a couple of different options when you're in that situation. As we've seen, no two situations in law enforcement are the same. Look at this incident. That is very different than any pursuit that I've been in. I'm sure it's very different than any pursuit that you've been in. When you look at this and say, wow, he was just met with a barrel of a gun. That is not the goal or how we want to end any type of a pursuit. So sometimes taking that extra 2 seconds to analyze, and ideally, what you want to do is turn that ending of a pursuit into a felony stop, a high risk stop, to where we're now holding that car at gunpoint, waiting for more backup, and ordering those occupants out of the vehicle. And I understand. I work in cities. Collin works in the second largest city in New Jersey. We have the idea that it's going to be a bailout. 99.9% of the time, it's going to be that. But we should take the time to analyze that and make sure that if it's a bailout, that it's a now unarmed assailant that we're running after. We know he was just involved in a shooting. He just attempted to kill somebody. So what does this guy have on the line? What's he going to do upon our first encounter?
Yeah, so you hit on some really good points there, and I'm gonna oversimplify some what are some very complex subjects that are studied by far more intelligent people than me, who write, thick papers about these things. But basically, human beings will always try to recognize patterns and put things into categories to make sense of things and recognize things and establish through recognition and patterns and all that uh, mental shortcuts, right? We look at things as cues and we anticipate what is going to happen next. And that's, a lot of guys in our profession are familiar with the OODA loop, right? So how do we orient to things that we're observing? Usually it's some sort of mental heuristics, right? We're taking shortcuts. I recognize this, I've dealt with this before, and what usually follows is X. And so in preparation for X, I'm going to do Y, right? With pursuits, as you mentioned, the vast majority of the time, if they don't get away, there's going to be a wreck and or bailout. And at that point, they're going to run. And we're going to chase them. That's our job, right? And that's, what most cops are thinking about is get the bad guy. And 99 times out of 100 or 999 out of 1,000, that's what it's going to be. And if the cop was to jump out of the car and stop and wait and move to a point of cover and do the things that we expect in a shooting, then his partner would be saying, "What are you doing? You're letting him get away. That 2, 3 second delay was the reason why he was able to get away. Why'd you do that?" Right. But then, again, as I touched on before, we start with the outcome instead of looking at why things made their actions made sense to them in the moment. And when we start with the outcome, we go, well, you should have known, you should have anticipated that they might jump out with a gun, and you should have had distance and shielding and whatever. Uh, is that what they were really thinking about in the moment? And now, in this particular case, it's important to understand, and in many cases, most even, it's very important to understand what happened leading up. Uh, Dispatch priming is a big thing we've touched on a couple of times. What information did they get through dispatch, and how was that information delivered? How did that contribute to their state of mind and maybe any physiological response that they were experiencing as a result of the stress that may have been amplified or exacerbated by the information coming from dispatch, right? So there's a bunch of things at play here leading up to the moment when they actually jump out. And then, we look at what happened from there. And as you pointed out before, when the vehicle comes to a stop in traffic, we see the passenger side officer jump out and quickly approaches the vehicle with his gun drawn. And then we have the subsequent shooting. So, why did that make sense to him in the moment?
I want to show everybody this video from Cranford. This was a couple years ago, well, year and a half, a little over a year ago, excuse me, December of 2023. So this was a pursuit on the Parkway. This was Cranford Police, and this is the very end of it. I'll put a link to the actual video. Here, the van crashes. As it crashes, they come very close to the vehicle. We're within a couple of feet, and the officer exits. As he exits, this individual starts shooting immediately at the officers. The officers close the distance, they shoot him, and ultimately his handgun is recovered. Uh, I've seen this video a few times. You can actually see as this subject is exiting the vehicle, the magazine falls out from his handgun. That one of the officers in that incident, unfortunately, was shot. He did take a round to the forearm. He's made a full recovery. I know that in this incident, the officers were cleared of the shooting. It was a good shoot. But looking at the 77th precinct shooting compared to this Cranford shooting, again, it's you're prepared for the bailout. You're thinking bailout, you're thinking foot pursuit, let's get up on that vehicle. I'm assuming. I wasn't there, I haven't talked to the officers involved, but that's what would be going through my head. But the more you see these videos, it's worth thinking, do I need to get out right now? Look at the environment of NYPD, 3 p.m., busiest city in the world. That is a little bit different than a midnight pursuit where you're surrounded by a wooded area. Ideally, you don't want him to get into the wooded area, then it's it's a manhunt, but is the manhunt better than rushing the car to possibly take a round? I don't know. It's again, my goal is to push out more information to get you to think that if you're in this situation, the only option is not to rush the vehicle. You have options. And the more of those options that you approach and you think about prior to that day, the better the outcome ultimately will be for you. Because you'll never rise to the occasion, always think to your level of training. And if you don't think about these other ways to approach these types of critical situations, we're doing a disservice to you.
Yeah, and again, you hit on a couple of really good points, and I'll say that while the two incidents are very different in a number of ways, uh, the the commonality between the two is that ultimately you have cops being cops, and what is their primary goal? It's to get the bad guy, right? And in both of these cases, we're dealing with bad people doing bad things, and the cops are trying to get the bad guy, and they're doing what they in the moment deem necessary to accomplish that, to get the bad guy. What I would suggest, though, and I hate to say this, but it's the day and age that we're living in, and that we're policing it. And I don't ever want to tell cops not to be cops, or to not go get the bad guy. However, there are some things that people in our profession need to be aware of, and in particular, right now there's a major case, very, very important for use of force in front of the Supreme Court, Barnes v. Felix. And what's going on there basically is the long-standing Graham standard established by Graham v. Connor is being challenged. And for those who are not familiar, that is the standard by which we have evaluated the lawfulness of police use of force for decades. And that Graham standard essentially boils down to, were the actions of the officers objectively reasonable, right? Would an officer with a similar level of training and experience have taken similar actions, or would they find the officer's actions in the present case to be reasonable? And what they're proposing is, rather than looking at whether the officer's actions were reasonable in the moment when they were faced with a particular threat, right, the so-called moment of threat doctrine, they're proposing that we look at the totality of the circumstances. And that's something that we're very familiar with in law enforcement, because oftentimes we will point to the totality of circumstances to establish reasonable articulable suspicion or probable cause. But when it comes to evaluating use of force, what they're really saying is we need to look at all the officer's actions leading up to the moment of threat and the moment where force was used, and evaluate that as well. And so now there's going to be much more scrutiny on everything the cop did in the moments leading up, and whether and to what extent and how those actions contributed to the circumstances that ultimately drove the officer to use force. And this is where we start seeing discussion about things like officer created jeopardy, for example. The classic illustration of that would be an officer who puts himself in front of a vehicle, and now the vehicle is being driven at him, being used as a weapon, and he shoots at the driver to address that threat. And people will say that the officer put himself in that position, created the jeopardy that then led to the immediate threat, and put him in that moment where, yeah, the use of force was justified in the moment technically because there was in fact a deadly threat. However, he didn't need to be there. The problem with this in application is that, as I touched on before, we will do things in the moment that make sense to us in the moment, trying to anticipate what is going to happen next and move faster through the OODA loop, right? So things that sometimes what follows is not what we anticipated. It's not what we expected. And so that analysis can become very troublesome because, again, a lot of times we're going to look at or start with the end result and say, okay, what did you do wrong to get there?
The reminds me of the Fife's split second syndrome. It's a study from 1986 that we discussed during our critical incident class and in Command One, and it talks about officers being trained. We can't train specifically to just one of these incidents, going back to everything that I was just saying about, no two outcomes are the same, no two incidents are the same. So you have to be trained in these broad skills. And especially in New Jersey with the overhaul of the use of force, they talk about time as a tactic, and they talk about how it's critically important for officers to try to slow these incidents down. They went even a step further with the recent barricaded subject um, policy that they just put out about how we purposely have to disengage, and we're not going to rush it just to make the outcome get to us faster. We're only rushing these incidents when there's life at jeopardy. So if you approach a felony stop, if you approach a majority of the situations the same way, sometimes that extra 2 seconds, 5 seconds that you take to assess the situation, that can be enough to maybe save your life, maybe save the life of a third party, because preservation of life should be the overarching principle that we adhere to with all of these types of incidents. So making sure that we understand that if you approach it safer, once it gets to court, it'll also look significantly more in the favor of the officer because it truly shows that you were trying to lower risk and lower the overall threat to life. The more that you're able to lower that, the better the outcome is going to come for you in a criminal, admin, and ultimately civil, right? A lot of the times in these use of force incidents, we may see an officer being cleared criminally or even administratively, but then the town pays out. And I know we talked offline about the Tamir Rice shooting. If you want to go into that, I could pull that video up. But in that incident, those officers were cleared criminally, but number one, you have to deal with the mental anguish of killing a 12-year-old boy, now knowing that this was a toy gun. And the city wound up having to pay out $6 million in a lawsuit. Nobody wins in that situation. Those parents don't want that $6 million. They want their child. So if we're able to slow that down, and I think it's worth breaking that down if you wanted to jump into that.
Sure. That was certainly a tragic incident, but it's a prime illustration of what we were talking about a couple minutes ago, where things work until they don't. And there you had an officer who did things a certain way countless times and was successful. So positive reinforcement of that course of action over the course of his career. And what I'm talking about here is, you know, that particular officer who was driving and was a field training officer working with a brand new cop who had no experience on which to base his decisions and actions. That that senior officer who's driving had worked in that area and had been involved in countless gun arrests and pursuits. And they respond to calls of the nature that we had in that incident many, many, many times. And what he knew, based on his experience, was that the overwhelming majority of the time, if not 100% of the time, the guys that they're going to confront, who are armed gang members and dangerous to the community, are going to run away. And so when they would approach in a vehicle, they wanted to get as close as they possibly could to the subject to maintain that mechanical advantage, and then, jump out and give chase. And so based on doing that successfully, however many times, it made sense to him to do it this particular time. But here again, we start with the outcome and assume that he did something wrong. And that's the thing that we point to and say, well, had you given yourself a little bit of distance and more time to make a decision and communicate, it would have gone differently. Well, why would he have done that based on his experience? That doesn't make any sense. Then the bad guy is going to get away, and our job is to catch the bad guy, right? So, in that case, obviously we know that it went tragically wrong. But again, looking at the Graham standard, in the moment when that junior officer stepped out of that vehicle and was face to face with a male armed with a gun who appeared to be pointing it at him, was he justified in using his weapon to defend himself? And he was, and that's why he was not convicted on any criminal charges.
And
Going to the
I was just gonna
totality
say,
of the circumstances evaluation, they might look and say, well, you shouldn't have driven up like that, but not give any thought or weight to the fact that that is what we have expected them to do, and that's what they have done successfully however many times before.
there were a couple other issues with that. The dispatcher was told that it was probably a gun by one of the 911 callers, or probably a toy gun, and that was never relayed to these officers. And the officers, actually, their first radio transmission was suspect down, male 20s with a semi-automatic handgun. They thought it was a real gun. They actually thought he was in his 20s, even though he was a child. Let me bring up that
Right.
video for anyone that's not familiar with it real quick. There's no audio. This was actually from the rec center across the street. But when the officers respond, he's sitting there at the bench, and you see him get up. You'll see a cruiser come in here. As the car pulls up, right next to the subject, passenger of the vehicle exits, discharges his weapon, and Tamir falls to the ground. And he ultimately did pass away as a result of those injuries. But when you
Yeah, and
talk about fight
what you
split
mentioned
second
too is that,
syndrome or any officer created jeopardy legal issues, the more that you see that the officers did not give them a lot of time themselves a lot of time to evaluate that situation. And we've talked about it in other podcasts, but whether it's Florida versus JL or anything else, the response to an armed individual is a lot different than the response to an active shooter. When you're pulling up to an active shooter, it might have been appropriate to hit him with the vehicle to stop that threat. Whereas somebody that's merely armed with a handgun is not necessarily a threat. I'm a police officer. I'm allowed to carry a gun. If I go into a Wawa before work to pick up a coffee, if I'm an armed individual, but I'm not dangerous, that would not warrant somebody running up to me and shooting me. Right? There's an investigation that has to go into it. And that's where it comes into the dispatch training and supervisors when we're in the field, making sure we're soliciting that information from a dispatcher, getting those callers back on the line. Okay, he's armed, but what specifically is he doing? Did you hear any gunshots? Are there injured parties? That changes the response compared to, like any of the school shootings that we see so much about. Those two calls are very different, but in officers' heads, they're very similar because of the way that we perceive that this is an armed assailant that's a threat to us and a threat to the public.
yeah, a lot of these things, seem simple at face value, but when you really start going a little deeper below the surface, you can start to see how complex these issues really are. The issue with the sharing of information from dispatch, what they did and didn't share, right? And them telling the officers that this was a 20-year-old male, Everybody wants to make a very big issue about the age of Tamir Rice, and he was only 12 years old. And I understand that. That's a natural human reaction to that incident. It's terrible. But, you know, first of all, can a 12-year-old kill you with a gun just the same as a 22-year-old? Absolutely. And it happens. But number two, the officer's perception is so important to understanding that what I call the calculus of reasonableness, right? And so how did that information provided by dispatch influence the officer's perception and what he was seeing? And when it comes to what you're seeing, by the way, even that is far more complicated than a lot of people understand. I'll give you, one example. If anybody's watching this video and they're looking at Joey, they can see over to your right or Joey's left that there's a nice J. Harris patch in the background there, that black with the bold blue stripe through it, right? So, I can look at that and I can clearly see the JH, and my screen is only a couple inches from my face, and that patch is only about an inch to the right of your face when I'm looking at you on my screen. I can read that clearly, but if I'm focused on that to read it, I can't see your face clearly. I can't distinguish your features. I just kind of see the shape of a face. Now, if I just shift my focus over very slightly and I actually focus on your face, I can see the general shape and color of that patch. I cannot read it. It's not possible. And you're talking about zero stress. I'm sitting in an office and I'm looking at something right in front of my face, and we're talking about inches, right? Now you put yourself in the position of that officer in that very high stress situation where he's experiencing the increased heart rate, respiratory rate, adrenaline dump, all these things. And now he jumps out and is confronted with a male who appears to be holding a firearm, right? We only find out later that it's a replica and not a real firearm. Where is his focus? What is he staring at? In all likelihood, I can almost guarantee he's looking right at that gun.
Especially for a brand new
That is
officer.
right. That is what is taking up his attention. That is the most important thing in that moment. And so that's where he's going to be focusing. He couldn't possibly see that boy's face and distinguish that, oh, wait, this is a kid and not a 22-year-old man. It's not possible. So, these, again, we're just scratching the surface here, but these issues are far more complicated than I think a lot of people realize or give credit for. And this is why, one of the things we talk about all the time is it's so important that in our profession, we start to recognize, and our leadership especially starts to recognize that use of force is a legitimate, genuine area of expertise that requires extensive training and education, just as, if not more so than any other area of expertise, like crime scene work or traffic investigation, right? And you send people to these weeks-long courses for traffic investigation and advanced crash reconstruction, and there's all sorts of math and science that goes into it. Understanding a use of force incident and really being able to do a genuine analysis of these critical incidents requires far more training and education than what a lot of our people recognize. And unfortunately, what we have a tendency to do is say, well, you're a first line supervisor. You've now that you got the chevrons or the bars or whatever it may be, you are somehow qualified to do the review of your officer's use of force with no specialized training or education on that subject, right? Or you've been a homicide investigator for however many years, so you can go out and investigate officer-involved shootings without any specialized training in that. And we're failing our cops, our agencies, and the public by doing that. It's something that we really need to address.
Right. That's why we're lucky to have you on staff to be able to, so I could call you anytime I have a question because I'm far from the expert. I like to study and I like to try to get up to your level, but we're lucky to have you. The one thing
I got a long way to go. There's far better people than me.
one of the things I wanted to get into also before we wrap up was just overall felony stop tactics. The I've always been of the mindset that you never stop learning, and we've just revamped our case law courses, and we always stay on top of it. We just launched a case law update course that Colin and I teach. I mean, it's overwhelming the amount of cases that come out. We're very lucky to have Cindy Glazier on staff with us that helps us with the case breakdowns, but it's a full-time job just to do that, let alone the stuff that we're doing on YouTube and social media. The we get busy with life, we get busy with everything. And if you're not purposely trying to advance your education in your career, you're going to fall behind the eight ball. And like I said, I'm of the mindset that I'm open to hear anyone's opinion about anything. And some of them make sense, some of them might not. I was just teaching a class in Connecticut, and I was lucky to have a sergeant from their SWAT team, their emergency services unit, and he was talking to me about the way that they are now teaching felony stops. And I really loved his approach. I've never thought about it this way. Anytime the way I was taught to do a felony stop, and anytime I've been involved in a felony stop, always at the driver's door, at the A pillar, over the door, giving orders from there, ordering the occupant out at gunpoint. And though that may have been very effective in the past, one of the biggest issues with that is it limits your mobility, and it kind of pins you into that A pillar if that assailant does come out, especially if it comes out with a rifle or any type of a high-powered weapon. Kind of limits your options. One of your options is to jump into the vehicle, hope that you could have the engine block as cover. But one of the issues with that is the way that the angle of the windshield is. As the bullets come in, they actually get deflected down. So those bullets are now traveling into the area where you're in cover. You also have glass that'll be coming down at you. And it's also very difficult to shoot out of a vehicle through that front windshield. It's not the best place to be. Another place that's an option is to be at the rear of the vehicle. And they've studied tons of officer involved shootings during a felony stop, and a majority of the officers actually run to the rear of the vehicle. The issue with that is that you're giving your back to the assailant. And by giving your back to the assailant, it's giving them a position of tactical advantage. That couple of seconds could be the difference of your life or death. So now looking at the analysis, what they're teaching is to now start that felony stop at the rear of the vehicle. That officer should be at his driver's side rear tail light with the cars perfectly aligned so that they are ordering the occupant out from there. Now, if the individual gets out to attack you, you have several pillars, vehicle pillars in front of you, which are actually proven by the Connecticut State Police to stop bullets. They had a Subaru that they shot over 100 times with a rifle before they were able to penetrate through one of the pillars. And obviously, it's not going to be precision shots during an officer-involved shooting, but the idea is that if you have those pillars in between you and that vehicle, it's going to deflect those bullets away from you and give you a time to react. It also gives you now the ability to not just move vertically, but we're going to be able to move now horizontally to where you can quickly move over to the passenger side, potentially flank that individual. And that approach to the felony stop is proven by them to be a better approach. I personally went over this with my officers in roll call, and that's the recommendation I give to them, that we should be going at our felony stops from the rear of the vehicle. Makes sense to me. In the analysis, they talked even about the fact that you're now giving up your PA system, but the reality is that it's just as effective to be loud rather than using the PA. Using the PA, especially if you're right-handed, it's very difficult to use the PA with your left hand while still ordering somebody out at gunpoint. So though there are some concessions that are being made, it does seem to be a better approach. And for me personally, the thing that was eye-opening is thinking about that horizontal movement. Because if somebody does come out and try to bring fire to me having that option to now move and hopefully come around and flank them from a position where they're probably not thinking that I'm going to be, I think that'll give me the tactical advantage, God forbid, if I need it.
Yeah, basic rules in the gunfight, right? Like shoot, move, and communicate. And if you're moving, hopefully you're moving laterally, getting off the X, and that lateral movement's going to make you a much harder target to hit until it's time to close with that threat. But a lot of good points there, especially besides the lateral movement, the good use of cover and concealment, all really good things. What I would just add to that real quick is anytime we talk about tactics, training goes hand in hand with that in any conversation about that issue. And when it comes to training, I would just throw out that one of the things we really need to shift focus on in law enforcement training as a whole is the decision-making process and training our officers to make better decisions and recognize things. Again, this is a very complex issue that we could spend hours just talking about that. But it's something that really needs to be changed in a meaningful way, versus just, standing on the 7 yard line and on the whistle, draw and fire 2 rounds or whatever it might be. We need to really start putting some serious effort and focus on that decision-making process and addressing that in our training. And for any instructors or trainers out there that might be watching this, I would strongly encourage you to pick up a book by a guy named Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. Fascinating book, and it will really help you to better understand the human decision-making process, how the brain works, and give you some great tools that you can apply in training to help our cops do better.
Yep. One other thing I want to talk about with respect to tactics, I'm going to bring up this second officer's body camera, Officer Reese. I hope I'm saying that correctly. When we're in these situations, just like you talked about being laser focused on the patch, right? I give a couple of analogies in our class that are similar to that. But if you're focused over here and you have hyper focused attention, you're not seeing the things that are happening up on this side of the screen. So let's look at this and look at the crossfire concerns. And again, this is not to criticize the officers. Those officers, my understanding is that they escaped unharmed. But look at the position that these officers put themselves in when they were actually on that scene. So right here, you could see very clearly that there is a crossfire concern. This officer is actually shooting as one of his partner officers is directly across from him. Luckily, he's pointing at an angle that's down. So there's a little bit less, but God forbid if he catches around and now he comes up, his partner is directly in his line of fire. So when we're approaching these situations, we should be purposefully putting ourselves in a position of tactical advantage. And we always talk about the tactical L. The tactical L is a proven tactic that dates back from anything of modern warfare, probably predates that to the Revolutionary War and beyond that when it comes to flanking. But if you're in that
It
L
goes back
position,
centuries.
yeah, I mean, I'm no historian, but I know it's before I was born. Let's put it that way. But when you're in that tactical L, you're controlling that scene and minimizing the risk to your own personnel. If you're swarming the vehicle at a 360-degree angle, bullets penetrate, bullets go forward. Like I said, if he caught around and he came up, his muzzle comes up. He's now coming up into the muzzle or directly into the line of fire of his partner. So you should be purposely putting yourselves in a position to where you're forming that L to minimize crossfire, whether it's room entry, the CQB tactics that we all learn and teach about button hooking, and when you enter that room, you're ending in that L formation, and where your muzzle stops is 3 foot off of your partner. We do that to minimize that risk. But when you're hyper focused on the immediate threat, you're going to lose focus of your surroundings. So how you mitigate that is being in a position of tactical advantage from the beginning of that interaction.
Yeah, some really solid points there. And again, there's at surface level, these are fairly simple concepts, but when you start really digging into it, it can get very complicated very fast. So it's important not only that our officers start to understand this stuff better, but especially that our leadership and our instructors and trainers are getting educated on this stuff so that they can deliver better training and hopefully produce better outcomes.
I was very fortunate that I took the CQB course with Northern Red. I know that you and I have talked about in other podcasts and even offline how superior their
They're
training
fantastic.
is on that active
Best
shooter.
type of course I've ever been to.
I loved it. And not only is it very fun, you're moving, your blood's pumping. It's using simunitions rounds to do actual fire, and then we actually go on our range with our rifles and do it in shoot houses with that movement. So these concepts I'm very familiar with, but I'm nowhere near an expert. But I was talking to them about how do I get better? How do I do this? And there's like the concept is simple. He goes left, you go right. That's your corner of domination. That's his corner of domination. Three follows one, four follows two. If two screws up, three goes that way. You're not going to do it perfect every time. But where they become elite is they do this every single day. When they're overseas, they shoot every single day. They do room entry every single day with the goal of perfection. The concept is simple. The difference in them, well, they're very athletic and they're special in their own way, but they practice constantly. If you did this course 3 years ago, you do not know what you knew 3 years ago today. The difference is that they're doing it every single day. And it's the same thing with anything we talk about. If you don't read case law for 5 years, you're way out of it. Well, everything that's relevant is within the last 5 years or so. So again, the more that you could think about these other concepts and try to keep your good training relevant, the better it's going to be for you, especially if you do ever have to testify later on one of these concepts.
When you look at elite performers, right, whether you're talking about a, tier one operator or a special forces guy or a, seasoned SWAT operator or a professional athlete, right? Anybody who is performing at a very high level in whatever it is that they do that requires anything physical, right? You're absolutely correct in that because they are practicing so much and they are masters of the basics, right? They're able to do certain things so much more efficiently and faster, and just they're experts, right? But the other thing that we see when we look at people who operate at that level and really evaluate them, there's an interesting concept out there called the quiet eye. And basically what it's talking about is focus, where they're looking and how much they're moving their eye or looking around. You're going to see a huge distinction between a novice and an elite performer, because that elite performer, because of all that training and experience, they recognize very quickly where their attention needs to be, and it stays there. Right now, think about this in the context of policing, and especially in high stress or critical incidents. Right, most of our officers do not have anywhere near enough training. I think we can all agree on that. There's just not enough time in the day. There's not enough money in the budget. There's not enough manpower. They don't get enough training. And so if we try to replicate these critical incidents in training and we pay attention to where they're focused, you will see that their eyes are all over the place because they're trying to take in information from all over the place versus, again, somebody operating at a high level, they know exactly what they need to focus on and their focus stays there. So just a really interesting concept, again, for any of the instructors or trainers out there, maybe want to look into that.
Any other key points you wanted to cover? I think we hit everything I was hoping to.
I think we hit quite a bit. Again, we could talk all day about a lot of these things, but just try to put out something quick to hit on a major recent incident and get some information out.
Yep. Well, thank you guys for joining us on LEO Radio. I encourage you guys to take Collin's Use of Force trilogy if you guys are interested in this concept where he goes much deeper into all these concepts, including the deficiencies of the body-worn camera. But until next time, stay safe. If you have any other topics or concepts that you want us to cover, leave a comment below. We're happy to do it.
All right, take care. Be safe.
This podcast is brought to you by the J. Harris Academy of Police Training. J. Harris Academy of Police Training is based in New Jersey and provides law enforcement training services nationwide for promotional examinations, use of force, supervisory development, and other key areas within law enforcement. This podcast is utilized to discuss key topics occurring within the profession. The opinions and information provided is for entertainment purposes only. In an effort to provide this, we often purposely discuss opposite views and opinions to spark conversation and develop discussion points. The contents of the show and show notes are all copyrighted. All blog posts, podcasts, and show notes that are distributed to the public for free can be redistributed via hard copy or electronic copy for free only if the J. Harris Academy of Police Training is included as the acknowledged author within the actual media that is redistributed. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog. Under no circumstances shall the J. Harris Academy of Police Training, any guests, contributors to the podcast or blog, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the company be responsible for damages arising from the use of the information provided.